Hey, it's Grayson. Haven't been here on the YouTube channel as much, been more active on the podcast at www.fixerpunk.com. And also, you can find the Fixer Punk podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts. You can type in the Fixer Punk podcast and you will get to subscribe. But I haven't been keeping the YouTube as much up to date as of late. Thought I'd come on here because, of course, unless you've been living under a rock for the past week or so, you have heard about George Floyd being brutally murdered by a police officer, with other police officers right there standing around doing nothing to help. And obviously, the protests that have ensued. Um, And the big thing here, first thing I want to bring up, is this is not just a one off incident. The reason why this incident is so profound is simply because the entire incident managed to get recorded on video in a way that showed exactly what happened, and what happened was so grotesque and so obvious that nobody can possibly dispute in any way possible that this was in fact a murder. Had there been a single deviation from that pattern, we would be having a different discussion. We'd be having needless debate, all kinds of shaming of character, just like every single other Black Lives Matter related protest has ensued. But what we need to do is we need to not look at these incidents alone. These incidents are symptoms of a much, much greater problem. A problem where law enforcement's not being held accountable appropriately. Um, People are not able to know what's going wrong within these agencies. Complaints are being suppressed. Somebody who had numerous complaints against them got warning letters instead of discipline. This situation is not one of those things where this was completely out of the blue. This has been happening forever and ever and ever, it feels like, and there's no accountability. Right now, it's probably easier in some jurisdictions for you to find out the complaints against the cafe car on your Amtrak than it is for you to find out the complaints about a police officer. And that is actually, there is a legit public records file you can find online about Amtrak cafe cars. And the struggles people have had getting police records are also very much online. Just a really funny example of the kinds of things that our freedom of information laws allow us to see and don't allow us to see. If it's of any importance, if there is anything that can potentially result in an adverse political outcome to a party in power, of course they're going to try and their darndest to keep it away. This should be, obviously, criminal charges being pressed. That's absolutely necessary. It's right to demand it. It's right to demand that the most appropriate charges, the most severe charges are put out there, because God knows what's going to happen when this goes to trial. Who knows what is going to be done after the fact to try to minimize this, even though you really can't with this. Um, and of course, this incident is greatly profound, but we have to look at what's to stop this from happening in the future. And a lot of it has to do with attitudes and sort of dependence upon a specific method of policing, and also the training and who gets to have this kind of authority and what kind of authority is over the authority. And we have to realize also that these types of incidents happen all the time, and we shouldn't just be upset about the most profound of them. We should be upset investigating every single time there is something that needs to be investigated, needs to be looked into. And also, a big thing that is coming up is how much of a role local officials have in this, because just like with all the stuff with coronavirus, local officials, state officials have the most power. These kinds of instances, local officials, um, city councils, police chiefs, sheriffs have a lot of power, and these are things that people don't even think of. So you have to sustain it through sustain your memory of what happened here up to down ballot positions in the upcoming election. Which that's not to say that elections are going to solve everything. Which that's something that people have been saying. No, no, no. We have to protest. And I'm for peacefully protesting. 100% for peacefully, unlawfully protesting. But a big caution here. This is a big caution. I'm gonna tell you, as somebody who has worked on the conservative side. Actually, for years, I was a board member of Tea Party Youth, and I also worked on conservative minority outreach efforts, including some efforts to inform conservative leaders about criminal justice reform and how that could be interpreted as a liberty-oriented policy. But what I do know is that anytime there's even mention of looting or anything illegal going on in protests, that is something that is immediately used to discredit any and all efforts to create the needed accountability we need for police. They are two completely separate issues. There is zero logic involved in saying, well, because people did things that were illegal in protesting, that we shouldn't have police accountability. Zero connection. Any connection you make is logically fallacious. But psychologically, that stuff gets implanted very, very easily, especially into those with privilege, because they don't get it, and we're psychologically programmed to be selfish and to not get stuff that we don't want to get. So the second that stuff happens, it decreases legitimacy. And I kind of thought of a saying here. If there wasn't a looting component to these protests, conservatives would have invented it, or would have wanted to have invented. And I am going to defer to some of the things we've heard from the Minneapolis mayor, from Marianne Williamson, stating that there's likely white supremacist involvement in some of these things, because a lot of what happens in protests, the thing that very important point about protests is that protests are actually they're not a means of actually creating changes. Just because you march in the streets doesn't actually physically cause anything to change. It is a way of getting attention and a way of making noise. Again, I have political experience and I have marketing experience. It's an experiential communication strategy. That's what it is. That's all it is. And you should use that in the most appropriate way possible. But there are people that can hijack it because it is a very fluid approach. When there's no leader, there isn't specific direction, it isn't organized, then directions can change very quickly. And there are people, provocateurs, who can theoretically get in and start making all kinds of trouble to make you look bad. Don't take the bait. If you actually want justice for people like George Floyd, you want Black Lives to Matter, don't take the bait of doing stupid stuff that doesn't help you. Of course, violence is all this violence, long string of very serious police violence is going to cause human beings and our natural primal instincts to start to have these kinds of feelings. But those things are not meant to be listened to. Those instincts need to be tamed. And when people are trying to provoke, when white supremacists, people that do not have the best interests of people of color at heart, people who are opponents, try to provoke stuff that is not right, That is something that has to be resisted very, very, very well, and it needs to be distinguished and right away labeled as no, that's not what our movement is. It's nonviolent. That has to be emphasized over and over and over again, because the second you endorse it, the second you give that stuff an inch, it takes a mile from what you're doing. And anything you're doing, of course, you may have heard the 80-20 rule. 20% of what you do gives you 80% of your results. Well, I have another 80-20 rule. 20% of what you do results in 80% of your problems. And that 20% has to be mitigated. That 20% includes everything illegal, everything ridiculous, everything that makes a movement look bad. That has to be mitigated very, very effectively, or else nothing is going to work the way it should. We can get into moral, philosophical arguments about who's right. And of course, everybody who is not one of these idiotic provocateurs who's trying to engage in sabotage is most likely well-intentioned. And I'm not casting any doubt on people's intentions other than, of course, the idiot provocateurs who are trying to seed things to make it easier for them to make straw man arguments. But that is something that requires caution. Just stay away from anything that makes it less likely for your cause to succeed. There are some interesting implications in relation to game theory, in relation to protesting and taking actions, because of course you've got the prosecution, you've gotten the charges, but they're not exactly what were desired. But there are some concepts we call in political science and economics game theory that would say you need to show and acknowledge that, look, you cooperated, so you get a reward. There's some game theory implications here as to why maybe the protests should retreat. But I might get into those a bit deeper in the Fixer Punk podcast. I'm not going to get into that stuff so much here. But I just want to give some of my statements about what's going on. There's an absolute atrocity was committed, and every single appropriate and proper step needs to be taken to not only get justice for what happened to George Floyd, but to prevent it from happening ever again. And every single action taken now needs to be aligned with that goal. And that's going to be my final statement and position, is that whatever is done needs to be done in a way that is most likely to achieve the objective you started with. All right. I didn't exactly outline this video, so some of it may be a bit of a mess, but I hope you got something valuable out of what I said. You can find the Fixer Punk podcast on any platform where you find your podcasts, pretty much. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeartRadio. Just search Fixer Punk, FIXERPUNK. I'll have some more stuff up there hopefully soon. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like what you saw here. All right. I'm gonna let you go here. Hope everybody's still safe with this pandemic going on. And I will see you again soon.